Hello, I'm Delaithna Dawatko here with your daily news. Members of the European Parliament calls for sanctions if situations in Ethiopia fails to improve by the end of the month. French dentist in Mekelle says he's suffering as a result of the total blockade that's been imposed on the region of Tigray. United States have warned it could sanction Ethiopia after CNN's report revealing Ethiopian's airline ferried weapons during this Tigrayan war. 25 civilians were brutally killed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces in the region of Tahul. Members of the European Parliament call for sanctions if situations in Ethiopia fails to improve by the end of the month. In a resolution adopted on Thursday by 618 votes in favor and 400 against and 58 abstentions, the European Parliament demanded the immediate cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access to affected population in Tigray, calling for an immediate return to constitutional order and for the establishment of a ceasefire monitoring mechanism in Tigray. Members of the European Parliament warned of the deteriorating humanitarian situation in this and other regions of Ethiopia. The Parliament called on all nations, regional and local actors concerned to end the blockade of humanitarian assistance and critical supplies, including food, medicine, and fuel, and to facilitate assistance to people in the region of the Amhara and Afar region. The report has strongly condemned the deliberate targeting of civilians by the belligerent parties to the conflict and the reported recruitment of children by warring parties, including the Tigrayan forces, and the continued use of rape and sexual violence as well. It also calls on neighboring countries to refrain from all political and military interventions that could further fuel the conflict at heat. Members of the European Parliament stressed the Ethiopian government is responsible for the safety and security of refugees and internally displaced persons on territory. They also urged the Ethiopian authorities to provide immediate protection and assistance to the thousands of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers displaced from the camps in Tigray and to determine the fate and whereabouts of thousands of unaccounted Eritrean refugees. Members of the European Parliament deplored the fact that 7 UN human rights humanitarian workers have declared persona non grata by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia. The EU stands for peaceful solution to the conflict, as they were said at the Parliament. Members of the European Parliament have warned if the humanitarian situation has not significantly improved by the end of October 2021, they want the European Commission to use sanctions against the members of the Ethiopian government and the government of Eritrea and the Tigray People's Liberation Front and others responsible for actions prolonging the conflict and exacerbating the humanitarian situations for millions and millions of Ethiopians. French dentist in Mekelle says he's suffering as a result of the total blockade that's been imposed on the region of Tigray. The French dentist, Benoit Pierre-Louis, told Tigray TV that he is now forced to live on the alms that he couldn't access his money due to Abiy Ahmed's multi-dimensional blockade and denial of service. The French dentist remembered how people were free and living normally before the war, which turned everything upside down, unfortunately. He said he could not afford the skyrocketing price of commodities, and he said is now relying on the Good Samaritan neighbors for his daily bread. He said he witnessed to the plight of the people of Tigray who are going to untold suffering on the blockade and the man-made famine, adding to himself as a victim of the problem. The French dentist called on the international community, especially the European countries, to exert concerned effort to address the crisis that's currently in Tigray. The Economist says Ethiopia is deliberately starving its own citizens. In an article published today under the heading "No Favors for Killers," the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and the London-based international online magazine urged the world to apply whatever pressure it can to force it to stop. According to The Economist, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia launched a war against Tigray region and ensuing conflict has been marked by the war on crimes. The journal mentioned the atrocity in the city of Aksum, where Eritrean troops fighting alongside Ethiopian forces murdered hundreds of civilians, mostly men and boys. Some were lined up and shot in the back. Others were gunned down as they came out of a church or murdered while laying in their bed. Horrifying as these crimes are, they're not being eclipsed by an even more heinous and a deliberate attempt by the Ethiopian government to starve its own citizens. More than 5 million people do not have enough food to eat. Some 400,000 of those are facing what aid agencies call a catastrophic hunger, which is the last step on the path to the mass starvation. While blocking aid to starve millions of officials in Amhara region of Ethiopia, they're beating the drums of the war. Head of Amhara Regional State Communications Affairs Bureau, Gizacho Muluna, in his recent tweet has revealed a plan to launch a major offensive against the Tigrayan forces. He urged the public to be vigilant 24 hours a day and do their planned operations in all fronts. In response, Getachew Reda, who's advisor to the president of Tigray State and the member of Tigray's Central Command, tweeted his reaction to the war posturing by what he dubbed as the expansionist bunch in Bahir Dar. Quote, "It's not news at all. They've been gagging for it all along. Whether the new Amhara governor is calling the shots or Abiy is, it remains to be seen." U.S. warrants its sanctions in Ethiopia after CNN reveals airline ferried weapons during the Tigrayan war. Timnit Bayru has more.
The Biden administration has described a CNN report that Ethiopian Airlines shuttled weapons to Eritrea as incredibly grave and warned that it was prepared to impose sanctions on Ethiopia and any other parties who prolonged the conflict in Tigray. On Wednesday, CNN revealed that Ethiopia's government used its state-owned commercial carrier to move weapons to and from neighboring Eritrea during the first weeks of the conflict. It is the first time this weapons trade between the former foes has been documented during the nearly year-long war in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. Reacting to the investigation, a senior U.S. administration official said, "These allegations are incredibly grave. They constitute a potential violation of the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. The use of civilian aircraft to ferry military hardware upends norms and endangers passenger aircraft around the world." The official added that the U.S. would not hold back from using all its tools at its disposal to put an end to a conflict that has triggered famine and left millions desperate in need of aid, including the sanctioning of officials responsible for drawing out the conflict. In response to the latest CNN investigation, U.S. Representative Tom Malonsky, a Democrat from New Jersey, called for Ethiopian Airlines and its executives to be held accountable, adding he would be in favor of individual sanctions against Ethiopian Airlines executives. If true, it's a very serious matter that goes well beyond our interest in ending the violence in Ethiopia, Malonsky said in an interview with CNN on Wednesday. Malonsky added that the international rules that prohibit civilian airlines from carrying military equipment are extremely important because if violated, they make it more likely that civilian aircraft will be fired upon in times of war. Malonsky added that the international rules that prohibit civilian airlines from carrying military equipment are extremely important because if violated, they make it more likely that civilian aircraft will be fired upon in times of war. So this endangers everybody. It undermines the norms that protect everybody in the world who travels on international carriers, he continued. Malonsky is leading an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, pushing the administration to determine whether genocide has occurred in Tigray. I think even the passage of the legislation sends a strong signal to the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments that their grace period is coming to an end, Malonsky said.
In related news, U.S. Congressman Michael McCaul has called for a bipartisan response to the war crimes and the possible genocide in Tigray. Congressman Michael McCaul, who's the ranking Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, made the call in an interview with CNN regarding the news network's expose on Ethiopian Airlines' use of civilian aircraft to ferry military hardware. Here's what he had to say.
Interestingly, the Prime Minister got the Nobel Peace Prize, of all things, in his ceasefire with the neighboring country of Eritrea. And now he's one of the grossest violations of potentially war crimes in what he's doing today. And so this latest reporting is very valuable to policymakers in terms of what's happening on the ground. And I think what is unfolding, again, I harken back to days when I was growing up as a younger high school student when we saw the famine in Ethiopia. I think this could be far worse and it could involve millions of people facing death by starvation.
Congressman also said he recalls the 1984 and 85 famine in Ethiopia during his high school days and wanted the current famine could be worse, leading millions of deaths to starvation.
No, I think it's very appropriate. There was an executive order issued by the President Biden, dealing with the threat of sanctions against those responsible. The chairman, and I'm the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have issued a statement calling upon the Biden administration to issue the sanctions moving forward. I think the latest reporting by CNN, actually well done, by the way, to uncover the fact that the Ethiopian government's using their airline to transport military weapons to Eritrea, which is a neighboring country, and becoming an ally of the government of Ethiopia against the Tigrayan population. I think to put all this in context beyond, it's important to note this could be one of the worst famines to take place in the 21st century. The Ethiopian government has basically blocked off 90% of supply trucks going into Tigray. It's also, they've harassed aid workers, and they've expelled 7 United Nations workers. So this thing is increasing in its crisis level, not decreasing since the ceasefire, and I think it calls for action with the administration.
CNN asked the congressman if Boeing should factor in its aircraft dealing with Ethiopian Airlines and all of these atrocities happening in the people of Tigray.
Well, I think there's a corporate responsibility aspect to human rights violations and violation of the human rights of the Tigrayan population when they are being blockaded 90%. Everything's blocked off from coming in the country since July, causing millions to die from starvation. This is, and I'm really glad that CNN International is reporting this. This is a really unreported story of a famine that's taking place right now in the world that most people are just not aware of. And I think the awareness piece is huge, and I call upon in a bipartisan way President Biden, the administration, to go forward with their announcement, go forward with the authorities we've given them under current law to issue these sanctions against those responsible for this human rights and humanitarian crisis. So we need to look at also whether these are war crimes against humanity and possible genocide.
The government of Ethiopia and Eritrea did not respond to CNN's request for comment. 25 civilians were brutally killed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces in Tokhul, in a locality in Dogat Tambane during the Tigray War. Asefa Kiros, who is the administrator of the locality, told TMH that the killings of civilians in Tokhul are manifestations of the level of unprecedented atrocities committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. Quote, many civilians, including the elderly who stayed put in their homes and were unable to escape, were also executed in broad daylight. In total, 25 people, the youth and the elderly, were massacred, and the invading Eritrean troops looted properties of the local population, loading on about 600 donkeys and their carts, and they looted everything including jerry cans, and the locality was razed to the ground, end quote. Residents said the invading forces slaughtered their livestock, pillaged their homesteads, and looted everything they found in their track. In November 2020, they killed many people. Also in the late June, when they were retreating, they killed and wounded many civilians as well. Those who sustained wounds are still suffering to this day. This concludes our English segment for the week, and we'll be back with more next week. Have a great weekend. Thank you.